thank you very much for coming to our first podcast of the art of scientific storytelling. This is Edward Perper, and I'm very honored today to have Dr. Peter Libby, who is I've been a colleague of mine for over 20 years. So we've worked on many projects together, and I really consider him to be a giant in the cardiovascular medicine world, both in terms of scientific research and, as importantly, in education. And Peter is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. He has literally hundreds of publications, as well as being editor of a major cardiovascular textbook. And his focus has been on, one of his focus of his research, his primary one has been inflammation and vascular diseases, especially atherosclerosis. And he's gotten many, many national and international awards. So I really appreciate you being here, Peter. And thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure to work with you and to have a conversation about our mutual interest in how to convey complicated material in a way which is engaging and communicates well with various levels of audience sophistication.
Yeah, simplification is really one of the key challenges, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You have to look at your audience, and every audience is different, and try to pitch your presentation to tell your story, as you would say. There's something for everyone, so that the virtuosos find something that's of interest and new, but the entry-level participants can understand the gist of what you're trying to convey. So you really have to measure your audience, and I think pitch your presentation to speak to various levels in an effective way. And that requires a lot of thought and some compromises. And the word that you use is simplification. That doesn't mean you dumb things down, but it means you convey complicated material in a way that people who may not be experts in the field can understand. We're both cardiologists. Isn't that what we do with patients? Isn't our job?
Absolutely, absolutely. So you're still, you're very active now, giving various kinds of educational and scientific presentations, I believe, like internationally all over the world right now, aren't you?
Yep, many times a week. I'm doing 2 recordings for the European meetings next week, and I just was remotely in Brazil this morning.
So let me ask you about storytelling in particular. And how do you see storytelling playing a role in science and medical education?
Oh, well, I think I used the word engaging earlier. You're in front of an audience. Right now, constant partial attention is the watchword, especially in the younger generations. People have their devices. They often will have their cell phones open. And so essentially, we're competing to convey our message with an onslaught of distractions. So how do you engage? I think you have to tell a story. It's not a recitation of dry facts. It's not a talking head. And what is a story? Well, I think you have to have a beginning, and a middle, and an end. So the beginning, you need to convey to the audience why this is important for them, for each individual, so that the ears perk up. Okay.
Right.
And then you have to hold that attention by actually delivering on that promise of conveying information which is going to be interesting or useful to every member of the audience. We already discussed how you have to pitch it at several levels simultaneously, which is a bit an art. And then I think the end, you have to sum it up, because some people will anyway be doing their texting, checking their stuff, or daydreaming about lunch, or their significant other or not significant other, and will be, you lose them midway, because during the usual presentation, the human mind will get distracted. So then you have to bring it back home and repeat your key points in a clear and straightforward manner that can be memorable. No one is going to be able to get 7 or 8 points across. When you begin to prepare your story, your presentation, lecture, or it has to do also with written material, you need to actually leave people with 3 or 4 messages. So you need to simplify in your own mind, what do I want my audience to take away? What do I want my listener to remember? And focus on the 3 or 4 things. So it's sort of the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
And I think that that's how you need to have a very strong finish as well.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you say 3 or 4 because, or 3, because I've heard people say 1, that really there should be one idea, one big idea that you can say in a sentence, maybe 2 sentences at the most, but ideally 1 sentence. What do you think about that? Is that too restrictive or not?
Well, I think the measurement depends on the time allotted and the task that you are trying to achieve. So if you have a 10-minute spot, then maybe 1 take-home message is enough. But if 50-minute lecture, I think you may want to get several things across.
Okay.
And I think in this world, having people's attention for more than 50 minutes is pretty ambitious.
Yes, the TED Talk model of that 18-minute maximum has sort of become the standard, hasn't it?
And I think probably with reason, it might be experience or might actually be in this current age of being able to actually get metrics of how long eyeballs are sticking. You may have a scientific basis as well as just a gestalt.
Yeah, so with regards to storytelling, why do you focus on it? Why do you use story? When you're putting a presentation together, you're asking yourself, well, what's the story going to be? Why are you doing that? I mean, and is there evidence in your mind that this approach is really different and really better than your conventional presentation approaches?
So your job as a teacher and as a physician, your job as a doctor involves communicating. And I found that the best way to communicate is to tell a story, whether it's a oral or whether it's written. I think that the way to bring audience or listener along with you is to tell a story, and it's the most effective way. That works for me. We all had teachers in school who would drone on with a dry recitation. One of my great teachers in a different era where one could be more directive, if someone was reading, would take away their notes and say, speak to me without the notes. And in fact, every week I'm in conferences where our trainees will present. And when the speaker is reading from the notes in the PowerPoint or speaking more extemporaneously, you can tell. And I think that the delivery is completely different if you're engaged in a dry, droning recitation, or if you are engaging the audience and yourself in trying to tell a story. And particularly when it's difficult material or it's controversial material, or you're trying to convince people who might be skeptical. Statistics and graphs and numbers are not enough.
Right. Now, one of the things that I have tried to do in the scientific stories that we've made at Science Branding Communications is this idea of creating psychological tension in the audience. Now, you sort of mentioned this at the beginning, right? So the very beginning of the talk, you want to create some tension, so you're going to resolve that tension. But even beyond the beginning, like in the meat, in the main part of the presentation, um, I do believe that it's very advantageous to create tension and then to resolve it and then to create it again. So my question to you is, do you think this idea of building tension and relieving it repeatedly is a good idea or not?
Oh, absolutely. In several levels. Um, First of all, I've talked about dry droning recitation, and one can use punctuation in your presentation if you're giving an oral presentation um, as a way to let things sink in or to break up the rhythm in a way, again, not to put your audience to sleep. In music, pauses are used in a very deliberate way by the best artists.
Mm,
And we don't sing when we're giving a presentation, but we surely can learn from how discourse is in music to keep our audience alert and following our storyline.
mhm.
So, you know, you can set up a point and a counterpoint and then try to resolve it. Very effective teaching, a pedagogical tool. It's very old, it's sort of a dialectic, you know, Hegelian dialectic, point, counterpoint, resolution, thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Right.
And that's a centuries old, probably goes back in rhetoric to the ancient Greeks of how you engage your audience. And then having the catharsis. The word catharsis comes from the resolution, the dénouement. The French word is the unknotting. So you have to, in telling a story, be it on the stage of the theater, in a dramatic presentation, in a piece of music, or when we are trying to engage and enlighten, I think that pedagogical tool is very, very important. In the mid portion, you know, the keystone arch of your presentation, to have that kind of, you call it conflict and resolution or point and counterpoint, I think can be an effective pedagogical tool, and maybe not for every presentation, but for most.
I can hear some people listening to us talking and saying, well, that's all very well and good, but it's for children. It's not for adults. Well, how do you respond to that?
Oh, I know. I think we're all children when it comes to listening to stories, right? It's just that the content of the stories may be different, but the structure and the you know, behavioral psychological kinds of tools, I think are very similar. We might learn more from listening to children as an adult, I think. And if you look at the fairy tales, um, they're very craftily constructed, you know, both, say, the Grimm brothers and the Perrault stories in France.
Mhm.
They all have a structure. Um, and kids have been engaged by these fairy tales uh, for centuries. So there's something to this. I think
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm willing to pursue the notion that maybe we're all children in the way that we want to learn, right? Because
Yeah.
kids
Yes.
by leaps and bounds. If you look at a toddler mastering the language and mastering understanding of the world, they do it in warp speed, and they're much more flexible than adults. And so
Mm.
maybe one of our maybe one of our jobs as a teacher is to try to reanimate some of that learning ability and curiosity in our audience.
I've
So,
heard some neuroscientists who study storytelling. You know, there's a little subfield of neuroscience now, of researchers who are looking into various brain imaging studies, MRI and other things, trying to get a handle on what's going on in the brain when people are telling stories. And one of the things I've heard them say um, is we're hardwired as human beings to listen to stories, to be affected by stories. Do you think that's overstatement? Do you think that's romanticizing something, or do you think it's real?
Why do we still read and listen to Homeric epics? There's the Gilgamesh epic. There's the Bible. The Bible's filled with stories,
Hmm.
with parables.
Hmm.
Um, I do believe that human beings must be receptive to storytelling, or else it wouldn't have endured for millennia.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. I mean, the fact is that we are exposed to stories all the time. I mean, we're in the media, in movies, um, but the art of actually doing it. I mean, we're usually consumers of stories, right? I mean, as human beings, right? We're consumers of stories rather than creators of stories. I mean, the other thing is, although, many of us are also creators, when you tell a joke, what is a joke? It's a story, right? It's a funny story.
And the psychiatrists and philosophers have looked at the psychology of humor. Henri Bergson, Freud, people have really dissected that in an intellectual way. Now,
Right.
you raised the important point about how do you teach storytelling? And in fact, we don't have formal training in pedagogy usually. But as an editor, both of journal articles that I spend much of my week trying to read and make decisions about as an editor, both scholarly journals, or the textbook that you mentioned, and then also the writing of my trainees and collaborators that were, this weekend I have 3 or 4 manuscripts that I have to go over. It's amazing how the red pen is needed uh, because people are not taught how to tell a story. The discussion of a scholarly paper is the recitation of the results, and that's not at all the best way to get your message across, is
Mhm.
to tell people what they already have heard. So I spend a lot of time just trying to get people to tell their story better.
So, Peter, one thing I really wanted to ask you is the skepticism that I have personally run into a number of times with respect to scientists, serious medical people saying, yeah, I don't want to use the word story. Story sounds fluffy, story sounds like it's like a fictional story. Um, let's use the word narrative, or let's not even go there. How do you deal with this issue?
Well, we've spoken about dry recitation versus really bringing your audience along to convey your message. And I think that we had hard science teachers during our education who were more the former, and then we had some that were more the latter. And I don't think there's anything um, cheap or demeaning about trying to tell a story. We want to convey our message. If you look at the lectures of Feynman, so physics is the hardest science, right? Some physicists believe that everything else
Yeah, it's definitely up there.
um, so Richard Feynman was a very prominent physicist, and in his lectures he told stories. Uh,
Hmm.
and Fermi's lectures, which were published in his own rather compulsive handwriting, also told stories. So I think that the best of the hard physical scientists, when they want to communicate, will use the tools of storytelling. And I think, maybe one of the problems with our society is that scientists have built themselves ivory towers with big, deep moats of jargon that keep the message obscure from the general public. So
Mm.
some of the issues that we face in public health today are because we in science and in medicine are poor communicators. Maybe the hard scientists should think more about elevating storytelling rather than denigrating it. There is um, no penalty at all for using tools to convey complex material to your listeners and your audience.
That's great. I feel the same way. It's sometimes hard because people have sort of an emotional reaction sometimes to the simplification process. I'm sure you've encountered this where people are very attached to the complexity of the data, the complexity of the numbers, the subtleties, the multiple levels of understanding. And they have this attitude that if you simplify, if you remove some of that complexity, that's like unethical or does a disservice to the science. So what are your thoughts about that?
I think that that's totally erroneous. I think your job as a communicator, as a teacher, as an interactor, uh, is to convey the information, not diluting the complexity, but your job is to make that complexity understandable. And you have to work hard in order to make it easy for your audience. And that's what your job is. And you'd better burn some midnight oil to figure out how you're going to do that. Just walking in and dazzling the lecture hall with equations on the blackboard isn't going to get your message across or elevate the audience. I think it's the job of the communicator to figure out how to communicate the information, be it complex or more simple.
Yes, 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 that's a really good point. I want to finish with one last question, and that has to do with the publication of scientific research in articles. Do you see any opportunity for bringing storytelling into the standard introduction, methods, results, discussion, references model? Is there a role for storytelling in that?
Oh, absolutely. I think the discussion of a scientific paper is an opportunity for doing that. As I say, in the beginning, you have to tell people why the question that you're probing is important.
Right.
But then in the discussion, rather than just repeating the results, which they've already read in the results section, chance to really put it into context. And you can do a good job or a bad job of that. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity in scientific writing. Now, I'm at a phase of my career where I can take more license, where I don't have to, if an editor thinks that I'm being too jocular or using too many cute tricks, I can take my paper elsewhere. But I'm having a lot of fun at the stage of my career when I'm writing reviews. Why can't we be poetic in science? Why can't we use some variety in our language? Scientific writing does not have to be boring. We do not have to wring out all of the life of our prose.
Yeah, I really like that. That way you're preserving the structure of the scientific article. You're not, starting from scratch, but you're bringing storytelling into the discussion section and sort of telling the story from beginning to end. Would you even feel comfortable, creating tension within the discussion, asking questions and answering them, that kind of thing? Would that be appropriate for a scientific article?
Yeah. Well, again, I think that we talked about the arc of a presentation. A scientific paper can be an arc like that, where I said there should be a beginning, a middle, and a finish. And indeed, isn't that sort of the structure of a scientific paper, where we have the introduction? Let's tell people why this problem is important and why they should be interested, and what we're going to do that's new and different.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And you start your stuff, and you try to do so in a way which is not dry and hackneyed, but maybe a bit more colorful and vital.
Right.
And then the discussion, there are no rules for discussion. There should be, which is not to repeat the result. But now is a chance for you to construct a conclusion to your story. And again, remind people what's new and different about what you did and why it's important. And where you're going to go next, and what are the unanswered questions, and what are the limitations of your own work that you're presenting? Because science is never complete. Every good paper should be the prelude to several more that will attack the next question and the question after that.
Well, hopefully we'll see more stories being told in the discussion sections of great articles. Well, this has been really fun, Peter. And again, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I hope this was useful to our audience to look into storytelling more, to have communication really be something enjoyable and as well as useful and empowering to people. So thank you so much again, Peter. Appreciate it.